There's a fascinating piece of research that was done years ago in which they took kittens and raised them in an environment where all they saw were horizontal stripes for the first 6 weeks of their life, their imprinting time. After they put the kittens out in the real world, the kittens ran into table legs and chair legs because, as far as their brains were concerned, vertical didn't even exist. It appears that human beings have a similar imprinting process, and it begins in utero, and typically that window closes around 7 years old. That's a lot of time to get your maps of who you are, who you're not, what the world is, what it's not. Sex, love, money, life, all of that becomes your blueprint. And it's transmitted sometimes through words, but also many times through actions. So if one of your caretakers saw a bump and some blood on your head and said, "Don't worry about it, it's just blood," the imprint for you would be this. And understanding that a bump on the head with blood is a scary, maybe life-threatening thing. Now, this imprinting that eventually becomes your self-fulfilling prophecy, which is a whole nother story for a whole nother day, can change. And human beings are the only creatures that we know of that can actually rewire ourselves. Now, organically, it can happen with a life-challenging illness or a near-death accident, falling in love. And don't you think it's interesting that falling in love is right up there with near-death experience? Also, a good therapist or a good counselor and psychedelics can also change the brain in such a way that it's open to seeing itself a little bit differently and reprogramming itself. And to me, that's just as amazing as the idea that maybe a PC would wake up one day and say, "Hey, I'd like to be more Mac friendly," and then do its own internal work to change its systems. It's just one of those commonplace but miraculous things that we can do. And the more mindful and the more conscious you become of it, the less you can be hamstrung by self-limiting, self-sabotaging imprints that we all have in one way or another. So when we have these imprints, if somebody steps on our emotional toes and we don't realize it, or we step on somebody else, we can get a response that seems larger than life, larger than the situation itself seems to warrant. I'll give you an example. A burner friend of mine has a very loud, booming voice. He came to visit me one morning, and I'd had a cup of coffee. I was kind of halfway into it, and his voice just sounded really loud, and I kind of went like, "Hey, can you keep the volume down a little bit?" And he responded, "All right then, I won't say anything." Luckily, I had at least a half a cup in me and a few brain cells that were snapping together. And I asked him, "What did you just hear?" He paused and said, "Oh, I heard you say, 'Shut the fuck up, James. You're such an asshole.'" I was like, "Whoa, where do you remember first hearing that?" And he said, "Oh, that's what my mom used to always say." Well, then I went on to explain that actually I had quite an interest in what he had to say, but that the sound and the volume of his voice was so loud that I felt like he needed to soften it so my ears could open up and actually hear what he wanted to say, that which something I wanted to know about. And so because I was able to ask that question and we could identify that what he was hearing through the lens of his imprint, he was able to receive my love and concern about him and realize that, like a bruise, he was very, very sensitive to people talking to him about the volume of his voice. Now, if you want to know what your imprint or another person's imprint is, all you need to do is listen to the I am statements. I ams are like, "I'm that kind of person. I'm not the kind of person that blah, blah, blah. That always happens to me. I'm not surprised. That's my kind of luck." It's kind of a general statement or response to, "That's who I am. That's how the world is. Tick-tock, the game is locked. And that's the way it's going to be." This kind of awareness, when you realize that these childhood imprints were for survival, but as a child, survival is a certain set of ideas, but as an adult, those very same ideas can be very limiting and very handicapping. And by the way, it's very simple to change your imprints. It's not always easy because there's a fear that comes with the part of the brain that gets imprinted. So, for instance, if I were to say to you, hey, want to change an imprint? And you'd be like, yeah, sure. What do you have in mind? And I said, how about that imprint that I'm sure we both have, which is look both ways before you cross the street. Well, hopefully you would be like, I don't think that's a good one. I mean, it got me from there to here in one piece. I really feel uncomfortable about that, and rightly so. Unfortunately, any imprint, even the ones that work against you, like children should be seen and not heard. So if you're a very silent person about your needs or wants, that might work well for a child in certain environments, but as an adult in a loving relationship, that could handicap you, right? So a lot of it's about context. Speaking of that, it reminds me of a client that I had, and I'd like you to pay attention to what we did together because it's basically a story of how to rework imprints. So I had a client, let's call him Victor, who came in to see me years ago because he was depressed because he had been passed over for the third time for a promotion that he really wanted. In talking with him about this disappointment, I asked him what his employer had said when he asked to be considered for the promotion. He looked a little puzzled and he said, well, I didn't ask him. Surely they saw what a good employee I am. Surely they would know that I would want this promotion. So I asked him if he had any issues with asking for what he wanted. Again, a puzzled look, like, well, I don't really ask for what I want ever. I can't think of a time. So I asked him to go back in his imagination. And the reason I asked for imagination is that the limbic system, which is the part of the brain that gets imprinted, is very childlike, very survival oriented, and remembers things through images and emotion. And so I asked him in his imagination to go back to his childhood to see if there was a time where he might have learned that lesson. It only took him a couple of seconds to connect with a childhood event. Now, I asked him to go back in that event in a dissociated state. That is, not like it's happening to him and he's seeing this happening, but dissociated where he's actually watching his childlike self experience this from a different perspective. Because if you go in associated, you're actually just kind of reliving trauma, and that's not useful as well as not pleasant at all. So he went in as his adult self dressed that day and saw the following scene. The little boy, Vic, had asked his father for some lunch money for school the next day. But the father was a raging alcoholic and very drunk in the moment. And he got so angry that Vic asked for money that he picked up a lamp, bashed Vic on the side of the head. And the next thing that Vic remembers is waking up in an ER with a bandage over his face, feeling kind of dazed and confused. And clearly you could see that might be why a child would learn, not good to ask for something you want. Anyway, I asked the adult self to then replay that scene, but this time when the dad had the lamp and went to bash his head, I had Vic grab his hand and say, stop. Now you go sit down over there. And I realized you weren't the best father, but I do know you did the best that you could given what you had, given that your father was a raging alcoholic, but it's going to stop here. And then he went over to little Vic and kneeled down before him and looked him in the eyes and said, hey, little man, this is never going to happen again. I'm firing your old dad. He did the best he could, but I'm going to be your new dad, and I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to give you the things that you want. I'm going to teach you how to ask for what you want, and we're going to have a really good life. And in his imagination, little Vic began to cry and hugged him around the neck real sweetly. And then my client, in real time before me, began to cry. And I knew that something had been reprogrammed because the limbic system gave an emotional response. Well, it turns out that was on a Friday afternoon and Friday evening because these changes happen very quickly. You can do talk therapy, and talk therapy can work for many circumstances, but sometimes it takes a long time to set up a story. You might have to do it several times so that you have a perspective that allows the brain to make the change. And the change always happens very quickly when it happens, just like an egg cooking. It's boil, 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 whoop, it's cooked. All right, so he goes home that evening, and it's Friday night or Friday evening, and his wife had fixed roast again because Friday night was roast night. But he really didn't like the way that she fixed the roast. She did it in the sort of traditional way, not the southern way of cooking it down to debris with extra spices and all of that. And he just appreciated that she did it for him, but it was kind of something that he would not look forward to on his way home. Anyway, he decided to take a chance, and he told his wife that he didn't really like the roast and asked if they could maybe do something differently. So you know what happened? She picked up a lamp. Nah, that didn't happen. But that was that childhood fear, right? Like something bad's going to happen if I ask for what I want. Well, she seemed a little surprised and said, actually, she didn't like cooking on Fridays and would prefer to go out to eat. So it became a win-win for both of them. And then, encouraged by that rewiring, on Monday, he went to his supervisor and told him that he was really disappointed that he was looked over for the promotion for the third time in a row, and asked why. And the supervisor seemed a little surprised himself. And he said, well, Vic, you don't have the extra training you need for starters, and you never indicated that you were interested in this job, but you would be a great person for this position if it ever opened up again. So how about this? How about we get you the training? The company will pay for the extra training. And if anything ever opens up, you'll be the first person that we keep in mind. So he got the training, and as fate would have it, within 3 months, the guy who got the promotion was transferred to Nebraska, and Vic just slipped right in, and I never saw him again. Anyway, it's a really good thing for people to understand that sometimes these triggering events and responses only have to be something that's slightly similar, and then something major league shows up in the person's body and personality and mind and spirit and expression. And so it really helps to have a lot of compassion and understanding that not everything is what it appears to be. I personally have heard people say things like, what an asshole. And I just don't believe that people are assholes. I believe that if you knew a person's story and understand what the triggering events are, that your response would be, oh, there's that little 5-year-old. Oh, because here's a secret. We're all 5-year-olds on the inside. The 5-year-old is always driving our bus. And it's the oldest and the wisest part of us. And if you understand the biology behind the limbic system and how the prefrontal cortex and the adult part of the brain can give yourself new information, in that very simple way that I described, you can consciously change some of those belief systems. Like a little sweater that kept you nice and warm when you were a kid can be very constricting when you become an adult. And you can learn to liberate yourself and create a better world for the burner community and for everyone in the world. All right, good luck.